Hi, so our topic is on the Townshend Acts. It's by Emma, Sienna, and Gabby. So first off, when we look at what we're going to learn during this presentation is the 4 Townshend Acts, basically what they were, what they did, what they were meant to enforce, why these acts were rejected by the colonies, and who exactly in the colonies was rejecting these acts, and then eventually why these acts were repealed.
So first, the Suspending Act was 1765, and the purpose was to financially assist the British soldiers stationed in the colonies. And the Suspending Act prohibited the New York Assembly from conducting any business until it complied with the financial requirements of the Quartering Act, which was of 1765 too. And it was for the expenses of the British troops that were stationed there. And in this map, you can see the English settlements and the English territory, and these were the areas that were affected by the Suspending Act. So, and then next, the Revenue Act of 1767 was passed by Parliament to replace income from the colonies lost when the Stamp Act was repealed the year before. And it was imposed direct revenue duties on important lead, glass, paper, paint, and tea. It also punished smugglers through writ of assistance, which allowed British soldiers to search colonial homes and businesses without a cause. And colonists rejected this by protesting no taxation without representation, and they argued that the British Parliament did not have the right to tax them and they lacked representation of the legislative body. And this picture up at the top was a drawing of an effect of the Revenue Act. And as I said, the direct effects were that it placed tax on imported leads, glass, paper, paint, and tea. And why did this happen? This replaced the income from the colonies after the Stamp Act was repealed. And over here to the right, you can see the actual act on the paper.
So next up, we have yet another act put in place to add new taxes and to prevent smuggling, and this was called the Commissioners of Customs Acts of 1767. So this was yet another act put in place to add new taxes and to prevent smuggling. This act created a customs board for the colonies to be headquartered in Boston by 5 customs commissioners. Other locations would eventually be opened up, but the first one was in Boston. The goals were to, number 1, increase and enforce shipping regulation like the Navigation Acts. Number 2, to increase tax revenue. And then number 3, to prevent smuggling. So basically, that was like the main goal of these acts, and that was what they were here for. So once this enforcement started, it led to lots of conflict and confrontation from colonist to authority, thus creating tension and conflict. This eventually led to things like the Boston Massacre and stuff like that. And even a quote from the act itself says that the act will lead to better securing of said rates and duties by the more speedy and effectual collection thereof, be it therefore enacted by the King's most excellent majesty. So on the right over here, we can see a cartoon demonstrating the protesting and high tensions between the colonists in England from not only these acts, but specifically from all the acts that were being put in place by England at this time, then a rendering of the Boston Massacre, and then on the far left, a print copy of the Commissioners of Customs Act.
Indemnity Act of 1767. So, to start off, the meaning of the word indemnity is security or protection against a loss or other financial burden, which is exactly what this act did for the British East India Company. It was passed on June 29, 1767. Its purpose was to reduce taxes on tea imported from Britain from the British East India Company, which was on the verge of collapse. This allowed England to export the same tea more cheaply to the Americas and resell it to the colonists for less. The British East India Company was going bankrupt because the colonists were smuggling Dutch tea, even though including taxes from Britain, tea from Britain was cheaper, and the colonists were doing this in defiance of the British government. They didn't want to give more money to support the economy. Part of the overall purpose of this act was to save the British East India Company from bankruptcy.
So next, when we look at why colonists and colonial leaders were rejecting these acts, we can see that most importantly, these acts directly imposed on the freedoms that the colonists were beginning to believe were their rights naturally, so the idea of natural rights. So things like taxation without representation, unfair and overpriced taxes, and then super highly controlled and limited trade through navigation acts and stuff like that. So colonial leaders knew that the British wanted to get the colonies to pay for themselves, and the Townshend Acts were a way to do that. But these acts were specifically designed to pay the salaries of the British officials, such as governors and judges, that the colonists didn't want over in Western America anyway. Thus, colonists didn't think that these taxes were needed or necessary. And then over here, we can see on this picture, a colonist looking at a tax on tea and a red coat behind them. And then we can see British officials and the colonies at the bottom. So the colonists felt that it was unconstitutional for the Parliament to place taxes and laws on them without representation. So this whole idea of taxation without representation became really important around the time that these acts were put in place. They felt that it was wrong for Parliament to place taxes on them, and it wasn't necessarily even about the cost of these taxes, but more about the principle of paying these taxes when they didn't have representation in Parliament. So because of this, in February 1768, the Massachusetts Assembly, with Samuel Adams, a propagandist and a major part of the Revolution, and James Otis, openly condemned the acts. And in Boston and New York, merchants revived the boycotts of British goods that had effectively diminished the Stamp Act, which we also heard about. And throughout most of the colonies, public officials discouraged the purchase of foreign commodities. They promoted the domestic manufacturing of cloth and other products. And by March 1769, the boycott spread to Philadelphia and Virginia and was highly effective. So we can see on the screen the stamps that helped represent no taxation without representation. We can see an image of British Parliament, who was the ones passing these taxes, and then we can see a portrait of Samuel Adams, who was a key piece in not only the Revolution, but in the repelling of these taxes as well. Thank you.
Why the acts were repealed. The Townshend Acts were eventually repealed April 12, 1770. This was because of mass protests, boycotts of British goods, and the closing of ports for imported British goods. Protesters wanted representation in the government. A really common phrase they used was no taxation without representation. These acts of refusal started to hurt the British economy. So Lord Frederick North requested Parliament to repeal these hated acts with the exception of the tea tax. This satisfied merchants enough to continue with the trade of British goods. What you learned. So in this video, you learned about the Suspending Act of 1765, the Revenue Act of 1767, the Commissioners of Custom Act of 1767, and the Indemnity Act of 1767. We went over why the colonists and colonial leaders rejected the act, the phrase no taxation without representation, and why these acts were later repealed.